This is Vinicio Cinta, and this is an interview for the Voces Oral History Project. Today is January 10, 2017, and I am in Chula Vista, California to interview Dr. Frank Newton. Dr. Newton, thank you so much for granting us the interview.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
And we'll begin by talking a little bit about your background.
Okay.
Can you tell me where are you from?
Well, I'm in San Diego again. I was born and raised in San Diego, and now that I am retired, I have returned to San Diego.
What were the names of your parents, and what did they do for a living?
My father was Nathan Newton, of English background. He was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1902. He was educated in England and went to college at Brown University in Columbia and got a law degree eventually and became a lawyer. He had a lot of health problems. He developed, he contracted something called rheumatic fever when he was a teenager, which damages your heart. It's one of the consequences of that disease. And so he always had a weak heart, and he ended up dying at a very young age, in his 40s. And he was living in San Diego. My mother was Isabel Cota Robles Newton, who was born in Mexico and came to the United States, like many Latinos of that time, Mexicans in particular, because of the Mexican Revolution. And they settled in Tucson. She was one of 11 children. And her family lived in Tucson up until the time she met my father, and then they ended up settling in San Diego. They had 4 children. I was the 4th. So I have 2 sisters and a brother. And we were all born in San Diego.
What was the occupation of your mother?
My mother was a housewife the whole time. She never got a real job.
So what part of San Diego did you grow up in?
I grew up in La Jolla.
So how was it during childhood? What are your recollections?
Well, we lived in a big house. I don't know if you know much about La Jolla, California. It is one of the richest communities in the United States, and it still is. Very exclusive. My father's family had a great deal of money. And he was, like I said, he was educated in England. All of his siblings were educated in England, and the family had, part of their livelihood was running a cloth dye factory where they would take material and dye it different colors. And the material was made in Manchester, England, and they had a factory there. And then they would process the material once it was dyed in South Carolina. So they had a factory in South Carolina, and so they lived in South Carolina also part of the year, and their principal home was in Brooklyn, New York. They also had a home in Maine, in Bar West Harbor, Maine. I think that was the name of the place. And he came to the West in the 1930s because of his heart condition. Like many people who settled in Tucson, Arizona, he moved there for doctors, because of a doctor's recommendation. It was much better for his health. And then later he moved to, my father and my mother moved to San Diego, where they had 4 children. And eventually my father had a heart attack in his late 40s. Throughout that period of work, of his career, he was an attorney.
So that was his job here in San Diego?
And in Arizona.
Oh, in Arizona.
Yeah.
And what about the schools? Where did you go to school?
Really just 2. I went to La Jolla High School. I went to elementary school in La Jolla, but also then I went to La Jolla High School, which, typical of those days, the late 50s and early 60s, it was a 6-year school. So you started in 7th grade and continued on until 12th grade. So I went to La Jolla High for those years, and then I went to UCLA as a freshman in 1965, and I stayed on. I got my bachelor's degree in anthropology, and then my master's degree, and then my PhD in what's called psychological anthropology.
All the degrees from UCLA?
All my degrees were from UCLA.
One question about La Jolla and San Diego. Were there, how did people get along back then in terms of, for example, the diversity of the schools or the diversity of the neighborhoods?
There was no such thing as diversity, like as in the manner of which you're referring. In those days, there was a Mexican side of town, which is where we are now. I live in Chula Vista. Chula Vista and San Isidro were and remain largely Latino. My house is 6-7 miles from the Mexican border, which actually I appreciate very much. I like going down to Mexico whenever I can, fairly often. La Jolla, La Jolla is white. It was and still is, largely. It got some diversity when the University of California at San Diego was established in the late 60s. And so there's been some cultural diversity, some enrichment in the ethnicities in La Jolla because of that. But still, La Jolla is still very much a rich man's town. If you cannot afford a house of $1 million, you probably cannot afford to live in La Jolla.
So, were the schools completely Anglo?
We had 2 or 3 Mexican kids in school, 1 or 2 that I remember in particular, and we had 1 or 2 black kids, African American, who were on the football team and basketball team. So it was very much racially stereotyped back in the 60s. And I really didn't learn about civil rights really until in the middle 60s is when the first time I really started to learn about civil rights, which is when a lot of young Americans did, with Martin Luther King and the protest marches and all of that of the early 60s. Before that, we weren't really conscious of any of that.
So, do you recall once the young people like you became aware of what was going on? How did you feel about it? What was the degree of your awareness and involvement?
Okay, that's a difficult question. It's a little complicated in my case. I was sensitive to the matter even as a child because my mother was Mexican in La Jolla. The only Mexicans in La Jolla that I knew about were all gardeners and maids and nannies. There were not very many just ordinary, say, middle class or upper middle class Mexicans in La Jolla. So we stood out, and it was a problem that I had to deal with because nobody I knew was really Mexican or Latino in the town that I grew up in. All my friends were gringos, were Anglos. So, and my name was Newton, and so it wasn't a big issue, but my father's family was from the East Coast, and I really didn't know any of them. I had a few cousins, but I had never met them on my father's side. They were all back east. So the family that I grew up with was my mother's family in Tucson, and they were all Mexican. So I grew up with a mixed identity at home. And when we went back to my mother's town, we were Mexican. We were Chicano. Even the word Chicano as a name didn't exist in those days. We were Mexican American. And the one key thing that I remember was my mother didn't want me to speak Spanish because and she explained it to me. She and my father agreed with what the prevailing view in psychology was in the 1950s and 60s, which is if you try and teach a child how to be bilingual, it will confuse them. And they decided that to make it in America, you have to speak English, and so that I only learned English. The Spanish that I've learned, and I'm moderately functional in Spanish, I've learned from my wife and work that I've done down in Mexico or Latin America as an anthropologist, and working with NHJ and others has given me an occasion to speak more Spanish. I'm still not really very good at it. If you give me a couple of beers, a couple of cervezas, my tongue loosens up a little bit. But mainly I grew up speaking English. So growing up, I had a mixed identity. And in La Jolla, I was basically a gringo kid. But with my mother's family, everybody was Mexican. And so I was aware of it. But I never had any real issues that I could point to. I think it's because of my father's name. My name was Newton. So it wasn't something that stuck out as I was growing up. I think if I had grown up with a name like Martinez or Gonzalez, then other kids would have identified me immediately as, oh, you're Mexican. But growing up as a Newton, it was not an issue. But I was sensitive to it. I was aware of it. Growing up in La Jolla is a very different kind of experience. You only deal with white people. You only deal with gringos. There are no racial minorities except as servants. I mean, the gardeners, of course, are Mexican and things like that, but just in day-to-day life, you don't deal with minorities.
And what about the rest of San Diego? Did you spend time in the other parts of the city?
Well, that was different too than what is true now. I think the world has changed a lot from the 1950s. My life in San Diego growing up was La Jolla. We came to the downtown once in a while. I hardly ever came to places like Chula Vista or San Isidro, the Mexican side of town. My mother, though, would go to Tijuana fairly regularly. So several times a year we would go down to Tijuana, mainly because she had some relatives down in Tijuana, and we would go down and spend time with her family. She had some aunts who lived in Tijuana. And yeah, growing up in San Diego is mainly La Jolla and the beach. La Jolla is a beach town. So I spent a lot of my childhood at the beach. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but...
So you mentioned that the term Chicano wasn't around.
No, not at all.
So when did you move to LA to start college?
Well, that's interesting because of racial relations. That's where I would say that's where it became directly meaningful in the sense of awareness, consciousness of the racial divides in America. I went to UCLA in 1965, which was the year of the riots in Watts in Los Angeles. So the city was still smoldering. The South Central Los Angeles, which was the African American area, still is, Watts, was still smoldering. I mean, there were buildings burned down and stores boarded up, and that was all of that racial violence exploded in 1965. There were race riots in Detroit and many other cities, and one of the more famous ones was the one in Los Angeles in Watts. So moving to Los Angeles, moving to UCLA really opened me up to the existence of a black community, which didn't exist in La Jolla, and also made me more aware of being Latino as well. So really becoming aware of the world happened for me when I went to UCLA. I would say my childhood was very sheltered up through the time I came into college. And I don't think it's that much different for other people my age. I think most of us grew up in very sheltered environments in the world. In particular, one of my favorite people in the media is Bill Moyers, with the Moyers Report. And he talks about that too. I mean, he grew up in Texas in the 50s, my age, and it was just a little small Texas town, and he didn't become aware of a racial identity and the idea of racial groups until he got into college. And so many of us were like that. We grew up in small town America, which doesn't exist too much anymore, I don't think. There wasn't things like the internet. There weren't TV programs about... the only Latino on TV was Desi Arnaz. It was very different in the 50s.
So when you get to UCLA and Los Angeles in general, did you see the beginnings perhaps of organized, for example, Mexican American students forming organizations or other types of activism?
Not until I was in grad school. In fact, MECHA, which got started, Mexican American, I've forgotten what all the words in MECHA are. You're familiar with that group?
Yes.
Yes. Was founded at UC Santa Barbara around that time in the 60s. There wasn't anything comparable to that at UCLA for Latinos. But the black community, there was the Black Panthers, had arisen in Oakland around that time. Martin Luther King, all of these things developed in the 60s and early 70s. And there was a tremendous awareness of it at places like UCLA, all colleges really, I would imagine. And I became much more aware of and sensitive to the issues at that time. And it became common for students, they developed Black Studies, for example. There were no classes at UCLA before that, before the 60s on Black Studies or Chicano Studies. None of those things existed back then. And so I took some Black Study classes, and a lot of us becoming aware of the world in college became very sensitive to these racial issues at that time.
Why did you go for anthropology?
That's a good question. I think, like a lot of young people, perhaps probably even today, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I did very, very well in math and science in high school. And I got a scholarship. It's called the California State Scholarship, which I guess was pretty prestigious back then. Paid for all my college funding. And my major was chemical engineering. And that's what I went to UCLA as. It was a chemical engineer major, but really a chemistry major. And I did that for a year, and I didn't it didn't click. I didn't find much satisfaction in it. I learned later, my reaction wasn't that different from a lot of people. Many people went into chemistry. Chemistry was a very popular major, I found out later. And one of the things the chemistry department did was they tried to weed people out. It's like, there's going to be too many chemists, so we got to flunk out people. And I didn't flunk out, but it wasn't a nurturing, inviting major. It wasn't appealing. And I think if I had done it all over again, if I had understood the nature of the world better at that time, I probably would have remained sensible. I mean, I probably would have been sensible and remained a chemistry major, because there was real work as a chemist or a chemical engineer. And that would have been my life. But other things appealed to me, in particular history and the social sciences, which I had never really been exposed to very much in high school. And that captivated my interest and attention. And I started taking anthropology classes and meeting some other students, and I transferred my major. The word anthropology, let me explain, is, I wish I'd known this. They didn't tell me this until I got my PhD. I like to think that anthropology, is a Greek word. And in Greek, what it really means is we have no jobs. And that's what I learned in anthropology. Was once you get the degree and you go out into the world, nobody knows what to do with you if you're an anthropologist. And so finding work was not easy as an anthropologist, which led me into other things.
And when did you decide to go to grad school?
Well, it was actually getting my BA in anthropology. I applied for a lot of jobs around LA. And I experienced exactly that, people just sort of shaking an anthropology major, I wish I had known this as a freshman or sophomore, that people would react this way. But employers just sort of shrugged their shoulders or shook their head and say, what's an anthropology major? And I had no future as far as I could tell. And one opportunity that occurred to me was, well, maybe I should go and get an advanced degree, which is, jumping from the frying pan into the fire, because then you get totally labeled with an advanced degree as an anthropologist, which makes employment even harder. But not finding any kind of real job opportunities out of college with an anthro major led me into grad school.
Just out of curiosity, did at any point did you consider working in the media or in journalism? Was that among your interests by then?
It would have been. And I think part of what led me from chemistry to anthropology was my fascination with reading and writing. I always enjoyed studying philosophy and history and learning about other cultures, and writing was one of my strong points even in those days. And I was conscious of this when I was running as executive director of California Chicano News Media before NAHJ. The Chicano News Media Association focused much of its attention on young Latinos, high school and college age Latinos, about getting into the media. And even then, when I was in the midst of doing that, reaching out to young people, I said, I wish somebody had done that when I was in college, because no, it did not occur to me to become a journalist. One of the real benefits of NHJ and CCNMA and other groups like that was that we made young people, it was the reason for our existence as a group, largely, was to make young people, it was to open their minds and say, hey, you could make a career out of this. There are really jobs here, and there are opportunities for you. Good opportunities. And it would be worthwhile and beneficial for you and for the community at large. But when I was in high school and I was in college, there was no such animal as any of these groups. And so, no, it did not occur to me.
Um, kind of in the same line. Did you were you an avid news reader? Were you interested in the news back then?
Avid is, I watched the news regularly. I was not a news junkie. I would say I was in the normal range of interest in the news and watched the TV news or read the LA Times regularly. But I wasn't I wasn't a news junkie, which even then there wasn't a term. They didn't have words like that. Yeah, my life would have been different if I had known about these opportunities. In fact, it was not, because my sense of identity as a Latino started to really develop at UCLA, not in La Jolla, but at UCLA. And even then, the idea of being a journalist, to the extent that it ever crossed my mind, was not something for minorities. It was not a Latino thing. So that was another reason why I never really thought about it. Everybody who was in the media at UCLA, and they had a student newspaper, which was very well known and very successful, everybody was a gringo. It was not... so it never really occurred to me, maybe there's an opportunity for me there. So I wish CCNMA had existed when I was in college. It would have changed my life.
So, what was your main research interest when you went back for grad school?
I was very interested in Latin America, and I did my first research for my master's degree in Guatemala. I lived in an Indian village. There were 700 people, and they were all Indio, truly, except one. So in a sense, you could say there were 701 people in this village. And the one extra person was a Ladino. Here we say Latino with a T, but in Guatemala in those days, a person of mixed heritage was called a Ladino with a D. And the only Ladino in this village that I worked in, and it was meaningful, I think, as part of my growing up process or awareness, was the government secretary. Every village, every Indian village, had a government employee, town secretary. He took down the information about births and deaths, marriages, all the legal kinds of things. And he was the go-between for the Indians and the government. So if any government issues came up, they went to him, and then he was the go-between. He got the announcements out. He was the town secretary. And as a sidelight, this has nothing to do with this interview, but I'll just throw it out because it's still stuck with me. I was doing research for my master's degree, understanding family life in this Indian village. And one night he came to my, I lived in a little hut. And he came to visit me to find out what I was doing. I was just a young grad student, and he came to visit, and he told me about himself and where he came from. He grew up in Guatemala City, and he had this job, essentially working for the government in this village. And I explained to him what I was doing, and then he stopped me in our conversation. He said, "No, but you're missing the point," he said. "Why are you here?" And I didn't really understand what he was getting at, because I went into my little elevator speech of about I'm a grad student at UCLA. I'm doing my research in anthropology. I'm studying, in this case, family, husband and wife relationships in an Indian village, very rural. And there'd been some other research by other anthropologists that I sort of was following from, so there was some theoretical logic to it. And then he stopped me and he said, no, that isn't what I mean. I said, why are you here bothering with these people? Or not, he didn't even say people, bothering with the Indians. And I said, what do you mean? And he said it, matter of factly, like I'm going to say it to you now. It just was so glib. He said it without emotion. He said, well, they're not human beings, you know. Which really took me back. And I think I reacted just this way. I sort of shook my head, and he said, no, they're not human. They're like animals. They don't have human emotions. They don't love. Their love is like perros, like dogs. They don't have any more attachment or human feeling than that, than a dog. And he said it so matter-of-factly, like, wow, and that's just the way it is. I mean, he had no compunction. And to this day, 30, 40 years later, it still stuns me. And it really affected me because I became much more aware of that kind of discrimination, the depth, and not even the emotional intensity of the hatred, the matter-of-factness of it. It was just like, of course, they're not human. I mean, can you even doubt it? I mean, it was so cold. It wasn't like, we hate Indians. It wasn't emotional. It was just, no, they're just like dogs. And subsequently, there was tremendous brutality for the Indians in Guatemala. In the years after I came back, that's when all of the death squads and the decimation of whole Indian villages in Guatemala really erupted. But that was at the heart of it. And it affected me very much ever since, even to this day, as we're talking. I resented it. I got angry at it. I didn't like it. It was very wrong. And I started becoming more aware of this and seeing it more and more. By then, seeing things on the media, I became more sensitive to that. Like, Martin Luther King. It became more real and relevant.
Did you ever witness or hear somebody say something like that over here in the United States?
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to play well in your video. I'll tell you a story. My sister married a guy from St. Louis, Missouri. And when I was a 10th grader, between my 9th grade and 10th grade years, that summer, I went to visit her. And it was my first time in the Midwest. And it so happened that my sister's father-in-law he owned as a part-time business, a miniature golf course at an amusement park. And I was 16 years old or so, and he said, well, would you take care of the place? I don't have my regular guy at the cash register on this one day. Can you sit in the booth, and if people want to play miniature golf, can you sell them a ticket, and you put the money in the cash register. That was pretty much it. So I said, okay. Yeah, it sounds interesting. I'd never done anything. So they drive me to the amusement park. And all of it, I see marching around the fence of the amusement park were 20 or 30 African Americans carrying signs. And they said, Jim Crow must go. And they were chanting this, Jim Crow must go, as they were protesting. It was not a violent protest. It was just they were carrying signs in front. Well, I didn't understand this. I didn't know what Jim Crow was. I didn't know what the reference was. And I wasn't sure why they were protesting. I mean, I was aware of Martin Luther King and civil rights issues, but I'd never seen it. And I didn't know what was really going on. It was later that my sister explained to me that blacks were not allowed in the amusement park. Well, anyway, that first day, that later, because I did it for a few days. I worked at the cash register at the miniature golf course. One day, the Pepsi Cola guy came. The miniature golf course, my father-in-law, my sister's father-in-law, had a Pepsi Cola vending machine. And this Pepsi guy comes rolling a big thing of cans of Pepsi to fill up the machine and to collect the money, I guess. And I'm sitting at the cash register, and he comes rolling in, and he says to me, "Did the nigger kid jump in the swimming pool today?" And I said, "No, not that I know. What are you talking about?" He says, "Oh, didn't you hear about what happened yesterday?" And then I said, "No." And then he explained. As part of the amusement park, there were various things. There were rides and things at the amusement park, miniature golf course. And there was a public swimming pool, which was a very attractive place because in St. Louis in the summer, it is very hot and very muggy. And going to a swimming pool is a great thing. So there's a public swimming pool at the park. African Americans were not allowed to go into the swimming pool. Well, what had happened was one of the kids from the people that were marching outside carrying the Jim Crow signs had a teenage boy, had the day before, jumped over the fence and had run and jumped into the pool. That's what the Pepsi guy was referring to. Oh, the nigger kid that jumped into the pool. The people were so outraged that this had happened that they not only got the boy out of the pool, but they made everybody in the pool get out, and then they drained the water, the entire pool. And the next morning they filled it up again because they didn't want white kids to get into a pool of water that a black kid had been swimming in. And talking about blowing your mind, that was really an eye-opening experience also. So, yeah, in several ways in my early life, my college years and late high school, I became aware of what some of these issues were and how meaningful they were. And I guess it's affected me my whole life. It led me into the work I did with CCNMA and NHJ and NHLA and other Latino organizations.
Can you tell us about your PhD and
well,
research?
As I mentioned, my work on my master's was in Guatemala, but when I went on for the PhD, what I found was not an opportunity to do research in Guatemala or Latin America, but an opportunity came up at UCLA through a big grant that had come in from the Carnegie Foundation to do research in Hawaii. Which, going in said, hey, there's an opportunity to go to Hawaii. It sounds like a good thing. So I went in that direction. It was still with a minority. I lived in a fishing village, one of the last remaining fishing villages. I don't even know if it still exists now, but in the 70s, on the big island of Hawaii, there was a village that was almost entirely Hawaiian. It was called Miloli'i. And even in those days, it was hard to find pure Hawaiians because many were mixed, especially Filipino Hawaiian, Chinese Hawaiian, a lot of racial mixtures. But even so, there were still quite a few pure Hawaiians in that village. And that's where I did my research. And I found that many of the experiences they suffered were very similar to what African Americans and Latinos experience here on the mainland. They were the minority. They were at the bottom of the society in their own island. The example that comes to mind often for me is to look at a courtroom. You could see the racial structuring of the society in a courtroom, ideally. It was crystal clear. The judge was white. The attorneys usually were white or Japanese. The arresting officer, often they were Chinese. And then the guilty person, the criminal, the one who was being prosecuted in court, was usually Hawaiian or Filipino. And this was so typical and so sad. And Latinos and blacks today here, and even to this day, it's still the same thing. We've made some inroads, but there's still a lot of discrimination out there in our society.
What was your dissertation about?
I studied what was called the Aloha spirit. My major was psychological anthropology, which deals with essentially the psychological aspects of culture, what's the meaning of things. And what was meaningful in Hawaii was what they called the Aloha spirit, which is love. Supposedly, in fact, the TV commercials in those days used to talk about, the Aloha spirit, and we all love everybody, and everybody in Hawaii loves everybody else, and it's the Aloha state. And yet, the Hawaiian people were a very violent people. A lot of physical violence. They were very physically aggressive people, very large. And they had a term which invariably they said with a hand gesture. Like they couldn't just say this term itself. It always was accompanied with a hand gesture. And this is the term, and this is the hand gesture. Hawaiian love. Hawaiian love is that. It was a lot of violence, a lot of brutality, a lot of spousal abuse. And the wives beating up their husbands too. It's just a lot of very, very physically aggressive. And so on the one hand, you had this Hawaiian love, a lot of violence, and you had this public image of the Aloha spirit where everybody loves everybody and lives peacefully. And that's what I tried to comprehend as an anthropologist in my research, my ethnography, was about the difference, the psychological factors involved in this split. This, on one hand, having a public image of being loving and kind and open and everybody getting along, with the private reality of physical violence. In the high school, for example, they had, racial, the Aloha spirit in commercials and when politicians spoke, always said, the Chinese and the Japanese and the Hawaiians, we all love each other. It's all, what's the Aloha state, right? Yeah. No, the high school near where I worked, Konawana High, they had days of certain violence would erupt. There would be Kill a Jap Day. And the Hawaiian kids would go around in gangs and try and find Japanese students and beat them up. And then they had Kill a Chinaman Day. They'd go around and I knew this because I had friends that were teachers at the school. They'd go around the campus try and find Chinese kids and beat them up. And then they would have Kill a Kanaka Day, where the Japanese and Chinese kids would try and gang up on a Hawaiian kid. A Hawaiian male is called a Kanaka. So they'd have Kill a Kanaka Day. And there was all of this racial tension and violence going on. And the end result for me, in terms of what I wanted to do with my life, was a sense upon leaving Hawaii that these people don't need an anthropologist. They don't need a social scientist coming and bugging them and exploring what they're doing and invading their lives. They need a good attorney. They need a good advocate, because they were always at the bottom of everything socially. That's why I mentioned the courtroom thing, where the person always who was arrested and being prosecuted was always a Hawaiian guy. They were always at the bottom of everything. And so they didn't need an anthropologist. They needed a good lawyer or somebody else who would advocate for them. And I guess that's an idea, maybe even unconsciously. I'm not sure I ever, even in all these years, I never articulated it quite as I'm doing it with you. It affected me in getting away from academia and writing reports, which would end up on a library shelf somewhere and gather dust, or contrasting that career with going out into the community and trying to do something that would directly benefit people that really need help. And so that's what I did. And I left UCLA and I started working in East LA. And that led me, after a while, to the Chicano News Media. This opportunity came up. Not that I was interested in the media, because I didn't even really know anybody in the media. But they were looking for an executive director for this organization that focused on Chicanos and career opportunities for young people, to get young Latinos aware of and moving in the direction, educationally, of becoming a journalist.
So what years are we talking about?
1980. 79, 80, 81. I started working, I became first involved with CCNMA in 1980. And in those days, it was a very small organization. They had a little bit of money. They had a part-time guy. It was a professor of journalism at USC. And he would do CCNMA stuff, he told me, out of his garage occasionally. And his name was Felix Gutierrez. And so when they hired me, it was a quantum leap. It was from him working out of his garage occasionally to a full-time director with an office at USC in the J School, the journalism school, with a staff. And it was a job. It was not something. Felix had done it part-time when he could. He fitted in with his academic work. He's a professor of journalism. Okay, but running CCMA was not his full-time job, and it was for me. So that was the first full-time executive director, and that's really where I got into all of this. And what appealed to me was not the media part of it. What appealed to me was the idea of helping young Chicanos become aware of careers that nobody else was making them aware of, just as nobody had made me aware of it when I was growing up.
So, taking a quick step back, so did you work with other East LA organizations?
I worked with something called the East LA Health Task Force. I was director of a health program for senior citizens. It's called the Multi-Purpose Senior Services Project. And I had several social workers and a nurse and some other staff people under me. And we worked in East LA with Latino elders, which really essentially was 65 and over. and helping them get the medical attention that lots of times they didn't get. And we had the social workers do an assessment of their lives, their needs. The nurse would do a physical exam. We had a doctor on call who could go in and do assessments or help them with various things. And I did that for a while, but then that didn't work out. And this other opportunity for CCNMA came up, and I said, well, that sounds like something worthwhile.
Did you know Professor Gutierrez or any other CCNMA admin
No.
before that? Okay.
No. The job became available because some money was made available from the Gannett Foundation. And Felix knew that he didn't have time to do it, to deal with this on a full-time basis. He had his teaching career as a journalism professor, and this was not something he could focus on. So a job opened up, and I said, hey, I'll put my name in the hat. I didn't even get the first offer. They offered it to a guy who worked for Univision. Or it wasn't called Univision in those days. It was in LA, it was KMEX, the Spanish language station, channel 32. And can't quite remember his name. Anyway, they offered him the job, but he didn't want to do it full-time either. He was a news director for the TV station. And he wanted to continue being the news director of the TV station and do the CCNMA stuff on the side. And they said, no, we want somebody who's going to be full-time. And he said, no, I don't want to be full. So then they offered it to me. So I guess in truth, I was a second choice. And that's how I got started. I did not know anybody in the media. And my interest was not the media so much as the idea of reaching out to young people. And one of the first things I discovered, because we used to try and organize events with high schools, because for a lot of young people, the first time they get involved in journalism and get exposed to it, or potentially could get exposed to it, is with the high school newspaper, which probably has grown up nowadays to be high school media labs, where they have radio and TV and internet and stuff. But in those days, it was just the high school newspaper. And so we would reach out to the various high schools, and in particular the journalism teachers. Well, and that's a significant point. Let me mention for anybody who's interested in this historically, high schools did not have journalism teachers, but virtually every high school had a school newspaper, and they would get the students to be the reporters and editors and whatever. And some teacher had to be assigned to oversee it. So who was it? I discovered from dealing with a number of high schools that it was the English teacher, some English teacher. Okay? And it wasn't just any English teacher. Invariably, it was the new English teacher, because the older English teachers who'd been around several years didn't want to deal with that. So when they hired a new guy to be the English teacher, said, oh, by the way, this extra thing, you're going to run the school newspaper, which everybody hated. So they were English majors, they were not journalism majors. And it was not a bonus that they were getting. They were getting stuck with a lousy assignment, and they had no training for it. So the amount of attention that many of these teachers put into it was not good. It was, I wouldn't say negligible, but it was not, oh, here's a great opportunity to help me as a teacher. No, oh God, I gotta oversee the student newspaper. So they didn't do a lot of outreach. It was whatever kids they could find, and they were not trained as journalists, so they didn't know how to train the kids. So one of the very first things we did with CCNMA when I took over was we started to have training sessions for high school teachers who were assigned to run their school newspapers. And that's where I learned a lot of what I just was saying a few minutes ago. We would have events at USC, and we would bring in high school teachers, mainly from minority schools, and not just Latino. Just usually it was African American or Latino high schools, and that's when and we would bring in speakers who were our members, the professionals who were the members of CCNMA would come in and give talks to this group of teachers about how do you do things as a journalist. And two things came out of it. One was the teachers really enjoyed it because no journalist had ever taught them anything. And they said, oh, wow, so maybe that's how we should run our newspaper. That's how you do a press release. That's how you develop a story and edit it properly and develop a headline or whatever it is, okay? And secondly, the second thing they really loved about these events was they got to meet other teachers doing the same thing. Because what each and every one of them felt, and I'm not exaggerating, was that they felt alone. Said, God, they stuck me with this job in my high school, and I thought I was the only one. And they're sitting next to 20 other teachers, all of whom were thinking, I'm the only one. And then they would start talking. So after we had our set of presentations by the members of CCNMA, I would open it up for them to start talking to each other. And they loved it because they all said, oh, well, what I did in my high school, and oh, God, I had this problem. And somebody said, yeah, I did that too. And the networking and the mutual support that came out of those sessions was tremendous for the high school teachers. So that was one of the very constructive things we did with CCNMA. So I was very proud of that. Nobody had really done that before, to my knowledge.
So who were the media professionals that you invited to talk?
Well, we had people from various daily newspapers, print journalists, and so we would have some panels dealing with that. In particular, people like Frank Sotomayor, who was an editor at the LA Times, and then there were other journalists from some other publications in Los Angeles. And then we had radio sessions because we had members who were in radio, KNX and KFWB in particular, news radio stations, and then TV. People like, there was Sylvia Lopez who worked for Cynthia Lopez, who worked for, I'm getting my names mixed up, Estela Lopez, there we go. She worked for ABC. Henry Mendoza, who worked, later I think he worked for ABC, he also worked for the LA Times. So we had Maclovio Perez, who was very popular because Maclovio was the weatherman on CBS, KCBS. And so he was seen every day on Channel 2. And so people all over LA knew who Maclovio Perez was. So if I had a panel session and I said, our speaker's going to be Maclovio Perez, the teachers loved it. Because they all said, oh, wow, you're on Channel 2. Wow, you're the weatherman. And so we had TV sessions and we had newspaper, print people, and we had radio people.
You mentioned that somebody from KMEX was considered to work at CCNMA. Was there a working relationship with Latino-oriented media like KMEX?
Yes and no. It was a difficult. It wasn't a simple relationship. Okay. And I'll put it on the record, but I'm going to say stuff that people didn't really talk about in those days, okay? Okay. There was a Spanish paper, it still is, in Los Angeles called La Opinión, which was very popular. And there were a couple of reporters, in particular a guy named Rafael Prieto, who was a reporter for La Opinión. And he became very active with CCNMA and brought in the sense of what was happening in Spanish media in LA. And another very, very active, supportive member was working at KMEX by the name of Maria Elena Salinas. Do you know this name?
Yes.
Yes.
Univision.
Univision, yeah. She's been the anchor for many, many years. Well, before Maria Elena became an anchor for Univision, she started out as a reporter for KMEX. And that's when she was very, very active with CCNMA. And she and I became good friends, along with Rafael, who was a very good friend. But it was largely limited to those few people. The president of KMEX in those days was a guy named Danny Villanueva, okay, who was he was a kicker for the LA Rams. And he took his money from football and he bought some radio stations too. And he got involved in the media. He didn't get involved much with CCNMA, but he was supportive of it. I mean, you know, he understood what CCNMA was trying to do. But it was just a few people, because most of the people that they brought in as reporters were from Mexico, both at La Opinión and at Univision. They did not, at KMEX, it wasn't Univision. They did not speak English. They were not trained as American journalists. Okay, they were foreign reporters, and they got hired. And this is where you're not supposed to say this, but they got hired because they were cheaper. It was cheaper to bring somebody in from Mexico and give them a reporting job than it was to hire an American who spoke Spanish. They would be paid more. So these guys did not get that involved with CCNMA. We used to try and reach out with Maria Elena and Rafael and a few others. We tried to reach out some. And we did have one really meaningful conference. The very first national Latino conference in the media was for Spanish language media. But in truth, there was always, and there might still be today, there was a big split between the English media and the Spanish language media. And part of it was because the reporters were not American. It was, like I said, it was cheaper to bring in some Mexican guy to be a reporter who really didn't know much about the United States, but it was cheaper. And they could fire him easier too, you know? So it's sad to say. Things were not great for Latinos in the media in those days.
I was going to ask something related to that, actually. So so there's the training and the education part. What other activities did CCNMA do in engaging the media industry?
We had two big projects on an ongoing basis. One, I had one staff person who did educational outreach, but apart from reaching out to the high schools, was a media job fair for students. And that was really the thing that put us on the map. It was not geared, that event was not geared for high school students, which the school outreach programs was mainly for high school kids. The media job fair was for college students and young reporters, people who had recently graduated from college with a degree. Either a degree in journalism, or they thought, hey, maybe I can become a reporter somewhere. And at the job fair, we would bring in news media organizations, their recruiters, to come and interview minorities. It was open to Latinos, to African Americans, to Native Americans. We didn't get very many, but a few Indian American students, and Asian American students Got quite a few Asian American students. But the largest numbers were African American and Latino. And when I took charge of that event, it really started to grow. Felix Gutierrez, that I mentioned, had done one before, and it's gotten the ball rolling. And then I took over, and it just started to grow year by year, mainly because the news organizations, the recruiters, started to find out that these kids were pretty sharp. And they said, hey, you know, maybe we may not have jobs, but we have internships, and we can introduce a lot of these kids into internships, and then they can work their way up into the news organization, and many of them did that. And it opened the eyes of a number of news organizations, and I think largely by word of mouth, the recruiters would tell other recruiters, and our numbers just shot up. We went from a few companies that would show up to more and more, dozens of news organizations would show up. And it really opened their eyes. There are two examples that come to mind that were particularly stunning to me. One was Newsweek. One of our members, who had gone to Harvard University, as a matter of fact, and had worked on the Crimson. The Harvard Crimson is the school newspaper at Harvard. He had worked on the Crimson staff and had gotten a job with Newsweek magazine and was stationed in LA. That's how we got from the East Coast to the West Coast. And he told me one time at a meeting, he said, you know, Newsweek has a really good internship, a summer internship, where they'll take college students and they'll put them in Newsweek news bureaus all around the United States. Okay, great summer opportunity. And if the kids do well, it's a natural way for them to get into the magazine to write as a reporter. Okay. And we had never had Newsweek come. So I called up. They were based in Princeton, or near Princeton, somewhere in New Jersey. And I called Newsweek from USC, and I must admit, being at USC was a big help, because news organizations wouldn't pay attention to us. Have you ever noticed when you can tell something by the way people, they don't have to say anything, but you can tell somehow by the silence in a phone call what somebody's thinking? And I always noticed it. I would call up news organizations and I would say, hi, I'm Frank Newton from the California Chicano News Media Association. And there's no reaction. At USC Journalism School. Oh, yeah, you're at USC. Oh, yeah, okay. I'm legitimate now. They'll pay attention to me. That was, it was constant. It was like CCNMA at first didn't have credibility, but you mentioned USC. Oh, I'll talk to you. So I called up Newsweek and I said, oh, we're doing this job fair. And a friend of mine who works for Newsweek said that you guys have a great summer internship. And the lady, and maybe you would send a recruiter, maybe there's some kids here. Because we had kids not only from Southern California universities, but University of Arizona got very involved, University of Texas at El Paso. We had students from all over the Southwest, and as it grew and became more well-known. And I said, you know, we got a lot of kids here, young people, and there may be some good talent for you at Newsweek. And she says, again, like the guy in the Guatemalan village, she said it so matter-of-factly. She said, oh, for our summer internship, we get all of our students from Princeton. Click. Just, that's the opportunity you have in forgetting, and working with Newsweek is a very prestigious opportunity, career-wise. She just said, oh, we get all of our students from Princeton. That's all. Just what else are we going to do? And I must say, so that's kind of discrimination you deal with. It's not visible, but it's very real. And I must say, to this lady's credit, 2 or 3 weeks later, she called me back. And she said, "Do you remember that phone call we had?" And I said, "We get all our students from Princeton." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "We've been talking here about this, and maybe we should go out and find some other kids somewhere else. We'll send somebody." I consider that was a big feather in my cap. I was always very proud of that. The other one, in exactly the same vein, and it wasn't me directly that was involved. I took my staff person in charge of the job fair, and her name was Magdalena Beltran. I don't know if you're going to interview her, but in any case, I took her to New York with me to meet various news media outlet people in New York City. And I set up an appointment for her with the New York Times. We had never gotten the New York Times to come to the job fair, okay? And Magdalena was more and more taking over the job fair for me, so I didn't have to deal with, I had other things to deal with. And so I said, "Okay, I've got a meeting for you at the New York Times. Go and tell them about the job fair, and we'll see if we can get them to show up." Because having the New York Times, send a recruiter, was a big deal. And so Magdalena told me, because we got together right after her meeting, she said, it was the most interesting thing. I did my spiel. There was a couple of editors from the New York Times, and they said, the reaction after I was done talking, she said, they looked at each other and they said, "This is a really interesting idea. Actually going out to look for employees." And she was stunned. She said, and then they ignored her. She said, they ignored me. And they just started talking about to each other about, this is a great new idea. Because, and the way they articulated it, she said, was that anybody in their mind, anybody who was any good as a journalist would want to come to work at the New York Times. So why should we go out and look? And it was so matter of fact to them. It was that same closed-minded viewpoint. And they kicked it around and said, this is a great new idea. We'll actually go out and interview people. We are the New York Times, and we're going to interview people. They like the idea. We'll find new people who, for some reason, may not have heard of us or ever considered working for us. And indeed, they started coming, and then they saw what we were doing. It was very helpful because the New York Times had a lot of money. And they came to me and said, you're doing a lunch as part of the event. I said, yeah. Well, who's paying for the lunch? I said, well, it's really a struggle. I said, oh yeah, we'll pay for it. Let's put the New York Times lunch on it. And I said, because these guys had big bucks. They had expense accounts. We didn't have any of that. We were always desperate for money, And they would just say, oh yeah. So when you deal with these big players, these guys have huge amounts of money. And it opened up the world for CCNME and later NAHJ. And so the job fair was very significant. And I've been babbling so much, if you forgive me. I mentioned there were two other things we did besides the high school outreach. One was the job fair. The other was, I forget, I'm having a mental, I forgot what the second thing was. Apart from the job fair, we set up it was the other thing. We had an employment service where reporters could send us their resume, and we would get the word out to news organizations and say, we have a pool of young reporters, and I emphasize young, because that was really the meaningful group for newspapers and other media, who are Latino, mainly Chicano. And if you've got a job opening, let us know and we can refer all kinds of people to you, okay? Working journalists. The reason I say young is because that if you were in the business already, let's say you'd been a reporter for 6 or 7 or 8 years, you had your own contacts. Other news organizations, other editors knew you or knew your work. And so you didn't have to go through a job service like we had. It was the young, the people who just graduated from J school, had just been in the business for 1, 2, 3 years, and editors around the city or other parts of California didn't know about them. So much of the job service that we had was for young Latinos, up and coming young professionals, because the older people were more established and had their own contacts. And plus they were looking for jobs. They were going from like, older guys were going for like reporter to assistant editor. And a lot of that was done in-house. They didn't advertise those jobs. They didn't go to a job service. They'd pick some other guy from the LA Times hired other guys from the LA Times to move them on up in promotions. So we had high school outreach for mainly journalism teachers. We had the job fair for students, and then we had the job service, a resume, job announcements for young professionals, and that was really at the core of what CCNMA did. We expanded later to a scholarship dinner to raise money for scholarships. That came a few years later. And that's what really put CCNMA on the map. Okay.
Talking about institutional relationships, first of all, were there any active African American or Asian American journalist organizations here in California at that point?
Yes, there was one in, first of all, there was, at a national level, there was an organization called the National Association of Black Journalists, NABJ. And they had chapters, which was really very different from what NAHJ became, but no, they had chapters, and they had a Los Angeles group. So you would meet black journalists, and they'd say, yeah, I'm with NABJ in the LA chapter, that kind of thing. So they had their own organization. And there was no Latino organization until CCNMA finally started to develop and blossom.
So it seems from what you've described about the activities that the relationship with the industry was mostly collaborative. It was constructive. Were there any contentions or any disagreements at any point that you recall?
With
the industry, with the media companies themselves?
Like a confrontation.
Mm-hmm. Or criticism in general?
No, we didn't take stands on issues. We had meetings. Every month we would have a dinner meeting at La Fonda Restaurant, which is near MacArthur Park. The gringos really liked coming because there was a mariachi group there called Los Mariachis en Naticano. And they were fantastic, tremendous. So they would like to come to our meetings, not because they were dealing with Latino journalists, but they could have a good Mexican dinner and they would be this tremendous mariachi group performing. But it would be our meeting and we would talk to them. So we would invite editors, news directors, publishers, and other people involved with hiring or developing the staff of various news organizations come to be speakers or just attend. Mainly they wanted to be a speaker. So we'd have, tonight we're going to have the news director of Channel 2 is going to come, or KTLA Channel 5 will send somebody. These contacts largely came from our members, like I mentioned Maclovio, who was a weatherman at Channel 2. So he had more pull. We had, much of it was that it was not contentious. It was to showcase, to make them aware of who we were, and that we were not yelling at them. We were not criticizing them. We were saying we have a pool of college students and young professionals who may be very beneficial to your news organization. All you have to do is sort of open your eyes, and you don't even have to hire them. If you interview, maybe you will find somebody that fits what you're looking for. I had an editor from a paper, and a lot of them are really racist, and they would never admit it, but he called me up and he said, you sent me a guy last year. He was dynamite. He was just dynamite. It's exactly what he said. But the Sacramento Bee offered him a job, and he went up there. I want another guy who's Chicano and dynamite. You got to send me I want another guy who's really dynamite. So, so they kind of resented the fact that when the Latino reporters proved to be really good, somebody else would hire them, that they would get pulled away. Like in baseball, you start out on one team and then you get hired by a better team. So they kind of didn't like that. He said, well, I'm going to hire somebody, and then as soon as they get good, the LA Times is going to take them away from me. I heard that a lot. That was the most contentious thing. It was not. We were not here to berate them. We were not yelling at them. We were saying, we have services for you that hopefully will make your organization a better news organization because you're diversifying your staff. I remember in a talk, we had many of these guys come and talk. Jerry Warren, he was the editor of the San Diego Union. Okay, he gave a talk. And he said he became aware of what we were doing and the value of what we were doing, not because people were yelling at him, but he went for a vacation. He was in San Diego here. He went for a vacation down to Baja California, down to Cabo San Lucas. And it so happened, he said in his talk, that when he was in Cabo, it got hit by a hurricane. Okay, a lot of damage. And he had this terrible vacation, but he came back to San Diego and he said, boy, we had a really bad storm down in Baja. What did you guys write about it? And they said, storm? We didn't do anything about it. And he said, yeah, we're in San Diego, it's like right there across the border. And they said, why didn't anybody cover anything? And he said, we don't have anybody who speaks Spanish. And even Jerry Warren admitted, he said, that's stupid. We're a newspaper in San Diego and we don't have anybody on the staff that speaks Spanish, that knows anything about Mexico. We're right on the border. And so he saw the value of CCNMA. And other editors and other recruiters who came to our job fair saw the value of what we were doing. So we were not there to be contentious. We were there to provide what we considered a worthwhile service. And really with no strings. We didn't say, you have to hire these kids. But here's interviews with 20 kids, and they're getting their degrees from Arizona or Cal State LA or UTEP, University of Texas El Paso, or Santa Clara or someplace in journalism, and they may be good for your news operation. And it seemed to appeal to them. It seemed to work. So CCNMA got on the map. We developed credibility and prominence, and we started to get admired by not only news organizations, because the job fair grew and grew. More and more recruiters would come. It grew ridiculously. It was tremendous. Because of the success, not because we were threatening them, not because we were saying, you guys are a bunch of racists and you should come. No, it's because we got real talent. And other newspapers are benefiting from this, and you guys you're missing the boat. And a number of news organizations started to realize it. And so it grew in a positive way, not because of any contentiousness.
How was the relationship with the Gannett Foundation?
That's why we existed. The money we had was initially, it was all Gannett Foundation. That's how we survived. And the vice president of the foundation, Gerald Sass, was the main guy. He was our main contact. Now, Jerry had been a pivotal person for the creation of the National Black Journalists. And I believe that once he had given them enough money and gotten them established, helped them through all their growing pains, he started, and he said as much to me one time, I can't even remember when. He started looking around. He said, there's no groups dealing with Latinos. And that's when he looked at art, and he said, oh, hey, you guys are doing all this stuff in LA. Maybe there's real promise here. And he offered us more money on a regular basis, thank God. And the other thing is the money started coming in because of the success. CBS was very supportive. I was doing a project, and I went to CBS for financial support in Los Angeles. And the guy asked me, how much do you need? I said, well, it would be $10,000. I think this would cost us $10,000 to do this project. And he said, I'll get back to you. And then he got back to me. We had lunch. It's really good when they invite you to lunch. That means it's a good thing, fundraising-wise. He said, I think you need $20,000. I'll give you $20,000, not $10,000. Great. So people started asking me, how are you getting so good at raising money? Why is CCNMA getting all of this attention and getting funding? Capital Cities Communications started giving us money. ABC TV, CBS, the LA Times started giving us money for doing these outreach programs that we were developing. And it was because we were successful. It's the old saying, nothing breeds success like success. And it wasn't because we were demanding things from them. It was because they saw real value. And as Gerald Sass himself once told me, he said, people write to foundations or other funding organizations, and they try and promote their need for money by the value of their cause. Like, we're doing really wonderful stuff, give us your money. And he says, that doesn't work. Everybody is doing wonderful stuff and needs money. What makes it appealing to funders is that you will make them look good in one of two ways. One is your organization is very successful and they have confidence that when they give you money, you're going to deliver. You're not going to mess up and waste the money that they're giving you, that you're going to actually do something constructive and successful. And then the second thing, as Jerry said to me, he said, the other thing is more practical. He said, nobody will yell at them for giving money to you if you're successful. Like, if they give money to you, and some guy at a desk at a foundation, you're not dealing with the Ford Foundation. You're dealing with a guy who's sitting in an office at the Ford Foundation who wants to stay at the Ford Foundation. Okay? And if he gives money to somebody and it fails, his bosses are going to walk into his office and say, "Why did you give money to that group? They failed. You're not doing your job very well." And then he's at risk of losing his office at the Ford Foundation. No, he wants to give money to organizations that are going to make him look good. Or at the very least, if you fail, he can say, "Well, yeah, I gave him money and they failed, but the Carnegie Foundation gave him money, so it's not just totally my fault." And they'll say, "Oh, well, okay, you can keep your job." They don't want to take risks. That's the bottom line. So the organizations that have success get money, and as they grow and have more success, they get more money. And the organizations come to them and ask, "Do you need money?" And people would ask me all the time, "How come we've been asking for grants from all over the place. Nobody gives us any money. And you're getting all these grants." And I said, they ask me, they come and ask me. I don't have to sit and write grants. They say, "How much do you need?" I say, "We only need $5,000. We need $10,000. They said, "Okay, write up something and I'll give you $10,000. It was because we were successful. We were delivering services that were meaningful to those organizations, and they saw the value of supporting us, and they saw the value of meeting and learning about minority journalists. And so when they made hire, and they would call up and say, "God, the person you hired, dynamite," or some other, like, "That person you sent was great, send me another one." And it became difficult afterwards. I got to find another dynamite person. But that's how it all started. And then how it grew nationally was that Latinos in the media in other cities noticed us. Just as the foundations and the news organizations started to pay attention to what we were accomplishing in LA, Latino journalists themselves in places like Philadelphia and Chicago and Tucson and Dallas and Austin and Miami started paying. They said, "I heard that you guys are doing this stuff, and we want to start a group over here." And in a very short period of time, we went from a handful of Latino journalism groups to dozens, just a few years. And then you have a media group in Dallas that grew up, the one in Tucson that grew up, one in, they had one in Miami. Took a while, but finally the Cuban journalists in Miami said, "Hey, we got to start doing this too." We started having groups all over the place, Sacramento and Fresno, and Latino groups in the media everywhere.
At that point, did they reach out to you for best practices or?
Absolutely, yeah. I was the guy they called. And the CCNMA board, I must admit, was not too crazy about all of that. And so I took some heat. But when people called for like Tucson, they say, we're struggling. We want to form a group in Tucson, but we don't know how to do it. Would you come and give a talk? And tell us what you do in LA, and maybe we can learn how to do it from you. Okay? And I would say, okay. And I would go. And it would help when they paid for, because I didn't have a lot of extra money from CCNMA, but they would pay and then pay me, not pay me, but cover my airfare and maybe I'd either stay at a hotel or at somebody's house, and in Dallas and Chicago and Philadelphia and New York City. And I started being invited to give talks to people all over the place. And I found several things. They were all suffering from the same problems, the same discrimination everywhere, whether they were Puerto Rican or Cuban or Mexican American, whether they were in Texas or Boston. There was a group in Boston that invited me. They were all being discriminated against. And they didn't know how to organize themselves, but they believed that, wow, CCNMA can do it, and we'll have a stronger voice. We'll have more credibility and visibility. We should do this too. And so I would go and talk to them and tell them, this is how we did it. These are the programs. We reached out to high school kids. We reached out to college kids. We didn't confront news directors. We tried to educate them and show them the value of working with us and addressing their needs rather than challenging them or condemning them or criticizing them.
You said the board was not completely happy with this.
No. There were some board members that were very supportive. One in particular, of course, was Maria Elena Salinas, okay, who I think had a broader vision and saw the value of this in both English and Spanish media. But others were very, I would use the word provincial. Like, it's LA or nothing. We don't care about people in Tucson. We don't care about people in Dallas.
Actually, kind of a parenthesis, I was going to ask about other parts of California. So were they under the umbrella of CCNMA, or was that?
San Diego did. And that happened in part because there were some CCNMA members who ended up getting jobs in San Diego, and they took the idea down there from LA. And it wasn't like they were foreigners. It was like, oh yeah, it's just, and they contacted the LA organization and said, okay, we want to start our own chapter down here in San Diego. And they had guys at KPBS and the San Diego Union, and we're not large numbers, like maybe one or two. But they were guys that had started up in LA, and there was a connection. There was a group in Fresno that was just Fresno people. They were not LA people. But they heard about what we were doing, and they said, yeah, can we be part of this? So ended up being, over time, we developed a Fresno chapter of CCNMA. And I took my staff up there. I took my staff from LA one time. Magdalena and Lourdes, I took them to San Francisco. I took them to Sacramento. I took them to Stockton, Modesto, Fresno, Bakersfield, to meet with Latino journalists in those cities. And some of them did start to form chapters. But it was like we were just planting seeds, kind of like Johnny Appleseed, and hopefully it would grow into something. And that was a conscious effort on my part. But it was not something advocated or promoted by the board. So I kind of got myself into hot water.
Did they try to stop you?
Yes. In several ways. They passed a resolution in the CCNMA board that I could not use any CCNMA money or staff for anything east of the Colorado River. So I could work with the journalists in San Diego or Fresno, but not anything east of the Colorado River. They were very explicit about it. And they didn't want to be part of the national group that was starting to take shape. After the first big conference in San Diego in 1982, I started organizing the next one in Washington, D.C., 1984. The board voted that I was not allowed to use staff to organize that event, which really handcuffed me a lot. I ended up having to hire another person with some money I got from Gannett, a Gannett Foundation, who I could use to be my helper. And so yes, the board did not want me to be involved in any of this. They didn't endorse the national conference either, the San Diego. If you look on the program from San Diego, you'll see that the chairman is Frank Del Olmo. He never attended any meetings for planning the conference. And one time at a board meeting when somebody asked him why he was chairman of the conference, because he never attended anything, he said, I just wanted to keep my eyes on them so, to watch them, to make sure they don't do something I don't want them to do. So he was not supportive. He was there to keep the reins on us from organizing anything. So that was very discouraging. And then, like I said, they didn't want me to spend any money or use any staff for anything other than LA, really, or some parts of California. And it became untenable after a while. As I started working with other journalists and they wanted to form a national organization, I finally had to switch over. For a period of 6 months, I was simultaneously, I wore both hats, CCNMA Executive Director, and I was NAHJ Executive Director. I was both, out of the office in LA at USC. And the board could not deal with that, CCNMA's board. And so I said, well, you guys don't want to support what I'm doing, I'll become NAHJ Director, so I'll just wear that hat. And I found another office in Los Angeles, and we moved physically from CCNMA. And I guess they were happy about that. They did not want to be part of this. And they passed a motion. It was amazing. You go off and do with all these other people what you're going to do nationwide, but CCNMA is just what's important for us in LA, and that's it.
So that sounds like so not only not joining, but it's also not working alongside an AHJ, or what was the?
No, refusing to work to be cooperative. So it was very sad. Some of the leaders of CCNM of the NHJ, and there's Juan Gonzalez, you can ask him, and Guillermo Martinez, who was the second president of the group, NHJ, came to LA with a peace offering to meet with Frank Del Olmo and Frank Cruz and some of the other major members of CCNMA, to say, we've created this new national group. Will you work with us? They did not want me to be at the meeting because they felt Frank Del Olmo and Frank Cruz would get upset that I was there, me personally. So Juan Gonzalez and Guillermo Martinez and one or two others went to meet with them. A powwow of the leaders of CCNMA and the new NAHJ. And said, the national guys said, we would like this to be brotherly. We would like to partner. We don't want to separate and pull away because CCNMA got it started. And they were told, no. You guys go off and do your own national conference and we don't want to be part of it. Now, what was nasty, that was nasty enough, was that they denied that later. They denied it, and that bothered me. It was like they didn't record their decision, even though they voted on it. It was like, we never voted, and we never, a couple of years later. because newer guys had come in and said, how come CCNMA is being left out of this? And I said, because you didn't want to be part of it. Well, we never voted for that. I said, well, why don't you ask some of the older guys who had said this a couple of years ago? And so they blamed me. And that was very hurtful. But, you know.
So I'm interested in this transitional period.
Yeah.
So there was the big 1982 conference,
Mm-hmm.
and if I understood correctly, CCNMA was already not completely on board with the conference, was it?
No. There was no NAHJ. Okay. So I called it a CCNMA event. Okay. But I invited people from other organizations because CCNMA really was not behind it, was not supporting it. And that's where I'd mentioned Kirk Whistler, the Hispanic publishers, they became part of it. There was a group called Hamas, Hispanics in the Media, broad general media, public relations and acting and other, and video media, TV and stuff, actors. Mainly not so much actors, but engineers and things like that. And it became a media conference. And CCNMA reacted to that too. So it's like, we just want a journal, this is pure journalism. So there was some contention about that, and that persisted until finally in the Dallas conference was, I think, the last one that we had that was broad, Latinos in the media. After that, it just became a journalist conference. So, yeah, so there were struggles. There were challenges, and some of the members showed up, but not as an organization. It was individual members of CCNMA would come and participate. And they would be panelists, and they would attend panels, and they would speak and go to the job fair. But as an organization, CCNMA really backed away and said, we want to keep our own identity. And that made things somewhat difficult for a while. And
so at what point did you get invited to the committee that created, or the group of people who created NAHJ as it is now?
I created the committee.
Okay. So at what point did it become a project, and did you start setting things up?
After the, when did, okay. We
were talking about the founding committee for NHJ.
Yes.
The committee that wrote the bylaws and all of that. So how did that committee came about?
Okay. It really started with a conversation that I had with Gerald Sass, who was vice president of the Gannett Foundation. I had mentioned earlier that we used to have a big job fair, minority job fair at USC. And Jerry used to come to that, and we had a lot of journalists from all over the country come to that. And I guess it was in 1981 or early 82, I guess early 82. He asked me privately at the reception, do you think we could create a national Hispanic journalist group like the NABJ? And I said no, because I was aware of some of the reluctance on the part of other journalists, especially in Los Angeles. But also it would have taken a lot of money and a lot of effort. And I said, no, I don't think it's going to be possible. And later that evening, I talked to Charlie Erickson, whom you're going to talk to soon. And I mentioned this to Charlie, and Charlie said, no, you should have said yes. Go back and tell Jerry Sass that we'll do it. I said, okay. And so I went back. I said, okay, Jerry, I thought some more about it, and yeah, maybe we can do it. If but we're going to need support. We're going to need help. And so Jerry committed. He gave us an initial grant of $50,000, and then much more later to get us going. Henry Mendoza was at that meeting, and he spoke to Henry also about the creation of this group. And so it was decided that I would be the director, the guy who did everything, the workhorse. And Henry would be the journalist in charge of it. Okay, so Henry became chairman of the committee. The problem for Henry was that, like a lot of Latino journalists, as I mentioned earlier, he didn't know a lot of people around the country. He had a lot of friends in the media in Los Angeles and in Southern California, but he didn't know many Latino journalists in other cities. And I did, because I had been traveling around, meeting with groups and meeting with people all over the country. And I either asked some of those people that I knew, or asked them if they couldn't do it to recommend people. A good example now, Maggie Rivas. I invited Maggie to be on the committee. I had met her before on a trip to Dallas. She had always been very interested, and the enthusiasm that they had for the idea was a key part of my decision making. I wanted to get people that were supportive of the idea of creating a national group. There were other Latino journalists who were more prominent, but were not really interested in this. And so I felt that a commitment to this effort was a key reason for being on the committee. And when I asked Maggie, she said, I know somebody in New Mexico who would be great, Paula Maes. I did not know Paula, but I put her on the committee. We put a list together, and we had to find in Miami. There was one guy who was always very enthusiastic. His name was Gustavo Godoy. Involved with Hispanic magazine? Or a publication. It might have been called Hispanic magazine. Anyway, he said, because I asked him, do you know anybody in Puerto Rico who would be supportive? And he knew of a gentleman, Juan Manuel Garcia Pasalacqua, who was a news commentator in San Juan, and was also a lawyer. And fortunately for us, since we didn't have all that much money, Juan Manuel had money to be able to fly here on his own. So that was part of it too. I had met Juan Gonzalez already, who was developing a name and a reputation already on the East Coast, not so much on the West Coast, but he was known among reporters in Philadelphia and New York and in Washington, and starting to get a name for himself, and getting himself well established on the East Coast. But because I knew a lot of these people, and hardly anybody else knew other Latinos in other cities, it was pretty much left up to me to come up with most of the names. Henry and Charlie contributed names, and like I said, Maggie recommended Paula, and that way it just it came together. We found a group of people that were committed and interested and supportive.
So in putting together the committee,
Yeah.
You mentioned that interest was vital for this.
Yeah, their supportiveness for the idea of this creation of this group was important to me.
So what was there like an explicit strategy to make it as diverse as possible, maybe geographically or in terms of types of media?
Well, the Latino groups were already divided ethnically Puerto Ricans were in New York, the Cubans were in Miami, And then Mexican American and Chicano groups in New Mexico. The Mexicans consider themselves Hispanic. In Texas, they call themselves Mexican Americans. In California, Chicano. So just by getting geographic diversity, we also got that ethnic diversity within the Latino community. So that was important. It was important to have people that were Puerto Rican and Cuban and Mexican American and Chicano, you know, Viva la Raza, all of that. So, yeah. But just, so it was conscious. It was a conscious part of the decision making. But it wasn't a hard part because just by focusing on geographic inclusion, we included that ethnic diversity as well.
And the other, I forgot to mention also that division between people who work in mainstream media and people who work in Spanish language media.
This was, if there was a problem with all of this, as it turned out to be later, it was mainly me. It was probably my fault. I wanted it to be inclusive because I had found that Latinos and other branches of the media were facing the same discrimination that the journalists were. And the number of journalists, I would say pure journalists, I mean people actually who were reporters or editors, were very small in number. And it made sense to me to reach out to others who were media professionals in a broader sense, but shared the exact same obstacles, shared the same kind of discrimination, had the same concerns and the same need for support and contact and communication as the journalists. So why cut ourselves off at the knee? Why make those distinctions right now when we're just forming? Let's be inclusive and get everybody who can contribute something. The publishers, and there was one person who was in public relations, not in TV, on the public media outreach for a television station, as opposed to being a reporter. Frank Gomez had been in Voice of America, but he was a very valuable person. He brought a lot to the committee, a lot of wisdom, but he wasn't a day-to-day beat reporter like some people were. And so we had a lot of people who were not pure journalists. And at that time, I think it was important. I wanted us to be inclusive. I thought that by being too segmented, too segregated among ourselves would weaken us. And there was a push for that even at the beginning of the segregation, because one of the things I did learn about journalism was that it is very fragmented. The newspaper people didn't like the broadcast people. And the broadcast people would make fun of the news, whenever newspaper reporters would sort of look down on TV reporters as not being real journalists, real hardcore journalists, because that was only a newspaper person. The TV reporters would say, yeah, well, we're laughing all the way to the bank, because they were making better money than the print reporters. And the radio reporters, the TV reporters didn't talk much to the radio reporters. And the radio reporters it was like our own little group, like we're radio and we're not TV, or, radio is its own special kind of journalism. And they all each thought that their brand of journalism, their field, was somehow more pure and better than everybody else. Well, and that's not just a Latino thing. All journalists do that. I mean, the radio people don't talk to TV people, even now. And they all are, and nobody talks to public relations people. Oh, they're flacks. And they do have names for each other, not good names. So I did not want that to be a factor. I did not want that to hurt us, that sense of separation. I wanted us to be inclusive. So I made a point of bringing people on the committee that represented different aspects of the media. Because in truth, we were all facing the same discrimination.
Was there any pushback at that moment?
No, I think we were just starting out, so I had some latitude because nobody really knew what the right answer was. We were exploring new territory. And since Jerry Sass, who was providing most of the funding, was not against it, they said, well, let's do it this way, at least to start out with. And so there was no downside to it. Like I mentioned, there are some journalists who consider themselves pure journalists, and they tend to denigrate others. And I understand it, but that's one of it's more of a creating divisions among ourselves. And I didn't think that was a good idea, at least not then. So in the beginning, the conference, the effort to organize was inclusive. NAHJ, that was for the conference. And I have to emphasize that. NAHJ was really just for journalists.
Yeah, so all of this applies to the
conference
committee organizing.
Yeah, and we focused on the conference. And after the success of the conference, the feeling was, well, we should formalize ourselves as an organization. And then came about the idea of having NAHJ, creation of an actual journalism organization.
Which required its own organizing committee, founding committee.
Yeah.
Because there was the need to create the bylaws and all of that.
Right.
So
Henry and I talked about it. Henry and others, I think Charlie had something to do with that, picking that committee. So it was another committee. I'm looking at the names here.
Is there substantial overlap?
Well, Charlie Erickson with the Hispanic Link in Washington, D.C. knew a lot of people on the East Coast. And he recommended a number of people, especially because I knew some people in the East Coast and in the South, but still Charlie had a lot of connections. So Charlie was pivotal in that. Henry knew a lot of people in the West. Gerald Garcia, who became the first president, was very helpful. He used to travel around a lot in his job with capital cities, and he got to know a number of people in different cities, which was rare. Like I may have mentioned in the beginning, most Latinos in the media just knew people in their own city. There was not that much communication or travel from city to city. And it grew. As more people started getting hired, as we had our national conferences, and people started going to different cities, and as recruiters started hiring people from other areas, people may, some reporter may start out at the Tucson Citizen and then get hired in Chicago. Reporters in Miami got hired in San Francisco. Reporters in San Diego got hired and moved to New York. So over a few years, people really did start getting to know Latinos in other cities. And it became a broader community.
So how was the work of that committee itself? Like, what was the work itself? Did they convene every other week or month?
No, the committee was spread across the country. So I did most of the work, and I was the only one getting paid. Anyway, I organized the meetings. I coordinated all of the travel and the meeting logistics, all, you know, the hotel and all those kinds of things, all the flights, making sure all the agendas were prepared properly, all of the nuts and bolts. And then I took all the minutes, all the planning and creating the bylaws. All of the grunt work basically was on my shoulders. Okay, reporting to the Gannett Foundation, keeping Jerry Sass apprised. I did a lot of that, and then when people had questions, they would call me. Henry and others were involved, but they all had jobs. So I did much of the work because I was getting paid to do it. But secondly, I had the time to do it. So on certain issues, you know, we might call several people, call Edith Auslander and get her input on something, call Charlie, but they all had regular jobs. So it fell to me to do most of the legwork and most of the organizing work, getting papers filed the way they had to, preparing grants, preparing other reports that we needed to get out, making just like we had our first big meeting in Denver, Colorado. So I made arrangements. I found the hotel. I found the meeting space. I booked all the rooms. I booked all the travel.
How were the locations for the meetings chosen?
We wanted to have geographic diversity because, okay, it's easier for the people in the West to meet other people in the West. It's the people in the East didn't know anybody out here. So we said, well, we should have a meeting in different areas to make it easier for those people to be more involved. Not only the members themselves, but they could have friends who would come and see what was going on and feel part of it. Because usually we had some kind of reception to meet other local journalists and other people in the media. So yes, we consciously chose different cities to make sure we reached out and got everybody involved. So they didn't all have to come to LA all the time. We wanted it to be broader for everybody to buy in and feel, yeah, oh, they came to our area. It's part of us.
And well, what you know, in the process of designing the organization, of shaping what would become the rules and all that, what were the most contentious topics or fields of?
Well, not so much about the conference. The conference was a different thing, because the conference, we wanted panel sessions on a variety of topics, and we included different groups in the conference. But in the actual organization, NAHJ, there was a real concern about who should be a member and who shouldn't. And the focus was on working journalists. Okay, they had to be employed as a reporter or editor or in some news gathering or reporting capacity. They could be a columnist, for example, or a news commentator like Garcia Pasalacqua was a commentator. And there was provisions for students. We had lower dues, but we also wanted students to feel involved and participate. They couldn't vote or anything, but we wanted students to feel they could join. And we had non-journalist membership, which cost more. And a few people joined. Most of the people, the non-journalist membership dues were much higher, to sort of discourage people from doing it. But because the focus really was on just being a journalist and working with journalists and having credibility with journalists around the country, not all journalists.
So do journalism educators fall into that last category?
Well, in those days, you could count all the Latino journalism educators on one hand, I think. There was Felix in USC. There was Ray Chavez at UTEP. You might have counted all of them on one hand and have a couple of fingers left over. There were very few. So that was not a big issue. Yeah.
Okay, so membership was a. How about other rights and duties like voting?
Well, it was limited to regular members. We looked at some of the rules for the black journalists, NABJ. We looked at some of the rules established by the newspaper, the National Press Club. So we tried to look at ASNE, American Society of Newspaper Editors, see what some of the rules that they had for their members to get an idea. So we were doing it was all new territory for all of us. So we were trying to get ideas from a variety of places. Probably one of the more, not contentious, but one of the more challenging things was that it was felt that we should have a statement of principle. This is what NAHJ is about. This is what we stand for. And that involved input from a variety of people. And the committee, hashed it out and everybody read it and then said, oh, let's change this and change that. So the wording of that document took a while, took a few meetings. And so that was more than just the nuts and bolts of like who can vote. Those were fairly simple, We would have elections once a year. People, how long will they serve? Is there going to be a limit to how long people can serve on the board? Those are, well, we'll pick a number. We'll say 1 year or 2 years. Those were not that difficult. But the statement of purpose was very important, and that took, it was not a matter of contentiousness, but just a real concern that the wording was just right.
So it was not really a disagreement about the mission itself, but about how it was communicated by the statement?
Yeah, it was, I have a mission statement. I guess you would say a mission statement. But people felt, yes, that's meaningful. That says who we are and what we represent. And so, not that people were arguing about it, but they wanted it to be right. They wanted the right words. They wanted the right tone. So it was a matter of quality and not, not a sloppy, just let's throw some words together and call it our mission statement. But some real thought went into it.
So given your experience with CCNMA, your work with CCNMA, would you say the new organization kind of followed the same general mission, the same spirit, or was there a significant difference that you could tell?
Not a significant difference because we were all facing the same issues. And if you'd like, I'd like to talk about what some of those issues were. Because it's meaningful. One that I have mentioned in a number of stories that I wrote for Charlie and it appeared in other papers, columns that I wrote. I talked about the taco beat. A number of Latinos got their jobs because nobody at a newspaper or TV station was covering what was going on in the Hispanic community. And at that time, the Hispanic community was just starting to rise up to the point of being visible to the powers that be in the media. They said, oh, we have Hispanics living in our city, Chicago, a big influx of Latinos into Chicago. Washington, D.C. had a big influx of people from Central America because of the war going on, in Central America. Boston was getting a very large Puerto Rican community. Yeah, and even places you would think that everybody would know, like San Antonio or Austin or Dallas. And there were no reporters to cover these. So they would say, well, we got to get the Chicanos, well, we got to get a Chicano to cover the Chicano community. The problem was, even though it was a job, it was not a respected assignment. So they would say, okay, something's happening in East LA, in Los Angeles, in the Mexican part of the city, East LA. Okay, we'll send Juan or Antonio to go cover that. Okay, but if something's happening in West LA, where there aren't very many Latinos, well, that's not for the Chicanos. The black journalists had the same problem. And the black journalists used to bitterly complain about, if it's about housing in Camden, New Jersey, they'll get a black reporter to go. But if it's housing in some other part of North Philadelphia, they say, well, it's not a black issue. Well, blacks live in houses. Chicanos live in houses. Chicanos go to schools. Blacks go to schools. It's not just, but it has to be in a Chicano thing, and then we'll send a Mexican to go cover it, right? Or a Puerto Rican issue for a Puerto Rican to cover it. But then they say you can't cover non-Chicano issues. You're stuck in that beat. And 10 years from now, you're going to be stuck in that beat. So there was no room for promotion. It was a dead end. So reporters would get started. They say, okay, I need a job. I'll take the taco beat. They would see it was a dead end. They would start searching around for some other paper, for some other news organization. And maybe they'd find it. They'd leave that place and they'd just go back and hire another guy. So that was one of the big issues. Another issue that really bothered me even more than the taco beat issue and the revolving door of people getting out of there and then they hire another guy to do the exact same taco beat. Another thing was an attitude that if you were a minority, you could not be professional. Conceptually, in the minds of the white journalists, they were separate. And I've used this 1,000 times, but it was a very meaningful example. A friend of mine who was working at the Sacramento Bee told me that he was walking down the hallway one day in the Sacramento Bee and and the boss, the executive editor of the paper, was walking the other way. So they were passing in the hallway. Big deal. Well, the executive editor decided, who was a white guy, to say something to my friend, Ricardo. And so he stops, and Ricardo told me, he says, he stops and he says, hey, Ricardo, you're doing so good, we don't even think of you as a minority anymore. And Ricardo was just like, wow. He didn't say, because he was a boss, he didn't say anything. But he did not realize, the editor, who was nationally known for being involved with NAHJ and being involved with black journalists and reaching out to diversity in journalism, even he did not realize the bias in there. And that what he's saying is, you're so good, we don't think of you as a minority. Which means, if you're a minority, you're not any good. You can't be a minority and good at the same time. And that was a very deeply entrenched bias that we all had to fight against. Very discouraging. Very tough to fight against that kind of prejudice because people are blind to it. Another one that I've mentioned to you was the Latino journalists that would criticize the Latino community so that they would be considered objective. I'll give you a terrible example, but it's a historical point that needs to be remembered. And I don't think the people in the LA Times want people to remember it. Certainly the reporters don't want people to remember it, but it happened. And it just goes to show you the kind of discrimination it was really deep-seated, deeply seated. And it's interesting, it happened to the people who were members of Chicano News Media, but it was true for everybody, all Latinos in all these cities. Okay. The LA Times in the mid-'80s decided to run special editions on various topics in the city from time to time. And they would put a team of reporters together. They did this on several different topics. Well, finally it was decided, we're going to do one on immigration. And we're going to get, they were getting more Latino reporters at the LA Times. And they said, we're going to put all of these Latino reporters together as a team and cover a whole bunch of stuff about immigration and related Latino issues. Okay? And they ran the series. It involved a number of reports by different reporters. But it was a team effort. And the LA Times was very happy with it, and they submitted it to the Pulitzer Committee for an award. And indeed, they won the Pulitzer Prize. Okay? This was a big thing for Latino journalists. Here's a team of Hispanic reporters that won the Pulitzer Prize. How do you think other reporters reacted? Do you think they applauded them? Or do you think they said, oh, it's a rigged deal. They just got the Pulitzer because they're minorities and the Pulitzer's trying to just placate the minorities, so it's not a real award. They didn't really earn it. Well, I'll tell you what the answer was. One of the editors involved with the project, the day or two after they got the award, took the team, they had a team meeting of the Chicano reporters in the LA Times, and then he said, we're going to go out into the newsroom and make this announcement that you guys won the Pulitzer Prize. And their fellow reporters, instead of standing up and applauding them and saying, good job, you guys, not one reporter stood up or applauded. They ignored them. They remained seated and silent. Nobody said, congratulations, you guys did a good job. No. They all just sat there, did not applaud them, did not congratulate them for winning the Pulitzer Prize. That's what Latino journalists had to face, that kind of discrimination. So even though they did a good job, it was felt, oh, you only got the award because you're Mexican. You know, you didn't really earn that award, that kind of thing. That was the attitude. And it was the attitude not only at the LA Times, but everywhere. Finally, one more thing that we had to face, and one of the things NHJ tried to grapple with, especially with the job service, we created a national job service, employment service, was the fact that many of the Latino reporters were the only one. There was like one of them at each station. Like there was one at this newspaper and one at this newspaper. And so maybe in this city, there may be 10 Latino reporters, but they all are one person at 10 different places. Like we had one at the TV station and one at that newspaper. And so they were the only one, which meant they had no sense of community. They had no sense of mutual support, which is what NHJ provided, was a sense of support that they could come together at the convention and in other activities and feel like I'm not alone. And that was very important to them. And there were negative sides, you know, being the only one. First of all, it makes you the only Mexican or the only Chicano, the only Puerto Rican in the newsroom. means you're you don't have anybody that has your back or anybody you can partner with. It's like you're always alone. Okay. But another insidious thing, and it's very degrading. I had a friend who was a reporter at the Albuquerque Journal. Albuquerque, like there's no Mexicans in Albuquerque, right? Okay. They had one reporter. One reporter. And he told me what really bothered him was that whenever someone came into the classified ad section of the paper at the Albuquerque Journal who wanted to submit an ad, for a classified ad, but they only spoke Spanish and they couldn't translate the ad into English, they would call him up in the newsroom because he spoke Spanish. He was the only one in the whole building who spoke Spanish. And he would have to leave his reporting job, whatever he was doing, come down to the classified section and translate the classified ad into English. And he said, do any of my white journalist partners have to do that? Do they get called down to the classified section to translate something? No, they're treated as professional journalists. I'm treated as your token Mexican Spanish speaker, and that's what he had to face, and he probably wasn't the only one. So there was a lot of discrimination. There may still be a lot of discrimination, but it was in fighting that, in trying to stand up against that, in creating a sense of identity and mutual respect and mutual support and having a voice with the editors that was really at the heart of what NHA was trying to establish, was trying to create.
So what were the specific programs or actions to fight back against those issues?
Well, since I was the executive director of CCNMA and then executive director of NAHJ, there was a strong tendency for duplication. Because those programs had worked so well for CCNMA, I thought, well, they seem to work and the journalism organizations appreciate them. We should keep doing that. So I created a national job service like we had in CCNMA. We kept the national conference. We had a job fair and a national job service. And we also had outreach to high school students. In the beginning, it was mainly just on the East Coast. But the idea was hopefully in time to start reaching out to journalism schools or journalism high school activities around the country. We never got very far with that when I was there, but I was only there for the first several years. I don't know if they ever had more success with it, but it was a good thing at CCNMA, and it could, or I don't know if it ever really was, but hopefully it could have been a good thing for the national program as well. So we did many of the same kinds of activities, or tried to.
And what was the policy or the how can I word this? So now it was an organization with national coverage. So there was a policy, or there was a rule set for local chapters, right?
No. Oh, that was, okay, I'm sorry. I'm glad you mentioned this. One question that came up in the creation was, should we have individual membership or should we have chapters? Now, the Black Journalists Association, NABJ, had chapters. And we thought about it, and one of the things we decided was the organizations that had started, like there was a journalism group in Tucson, there was a journalism group in Dallas, and in other cities. They decided they wanted to keep their own local identity. Like, we're local, we'll deal with in Tucson, we'll deal with our Tucson issues. in our Tucson media. But our individual members, our individual journalists, can join NAHJ. So it was decided, okay, we will not be a group of chapters. We'll just be a group of individual members. Okay?
Speaking about local geography, how about the decision for the headquarters? Was that a matter of debate where to place the central office?
No, it was not a point of debate. It was largely left up to me because I was going to have to deal with it. And Gerald Sass put in his druthers. He had indicated where he wanted us to be. Charlie pushed me a lot. Charlie wanted it to be in Washington, which is where Charlie Erickson was. There was some push for, some interest in having it in New York City. But so I started looking around. We got an offer in Dallas, Texas. And I think it was Maggie who helped get the offer. Her boss was, I think his name was Daryl Osborne. Byrne. No, what was his name? I've forgotten his name. He was a publisher, editor of the Morning News, and of Belo Corporation, okay, a big shot. And they had extra space in the building. They just moved into a new building in Dallas. They had extra space, and they said, you guys can have an office here. We'll give it to you. When Jerry Sass found out, he got on the next plane. Literally, I'm not exaggerating. He told me he was in Sacramento. He found out, and he got on a plane, the next plane out of Sacramento, to come to LA and talk to me. He said, don't go to Dallas, whatever you do. Because if you go to Dallas, you'll be considered a Texas organization. If you go to Chicago, you'll be considered a Midwest organization. You will not be considered a national organization unless you go to Washington, D.C. or New York. And Washington, D.C. had the advantage of being the home of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, the American Society of Publishers, the National Association of Black Journalists. They were all based in Washington, D.C. New York made sense in that it was the media capital, and still is. So I went to both cities and checked it out to see. I went to NYU, the journalism school. I even approached Columbia University, which had a famous journalism school. None of them were interested in providing office space. In Washington, I went to the University of Maryland, which is not in D.C., but is close. They have a journalism school, very well regarded. They would not provide office space. And then, of course, I went to the American Society of Newspaper Editors because the American Society of Newspaper Editors had a big building, and they were the group we were trying to impact, and they had provided space to the black journalists. So the office of the National Association of Black Journalists was in the press building, in the American Society of Newspaper building. And I'm sure Jerry Sass wanted me to go there. And I went a couple of times. And I met with the black journalists, and I met with the director of the Society of Newspaper Editors, ASNE. And they all said, we would love to have you, but we don't have any space. I said, well, you made space for the black journalists. And they said, well, that's because we moved into this building a few years ago, and when it was a brand new building, we had empty offices, and we gave them one. But now we're not brand new anymore, and we filled up all of our space, and everything's gone. And so I kept looking around, and somebody suggested the National Press Building, which had the National Press Club and many, many news organizations with field offices there. And journalists from around the world were always going into the National Press Building. It's one of the main places you go if you're in the media and you go to Washington, D.C., is you go to the National Press Building. There's just a lot of action there, a lot of activity, a lot of contacts. So I went to the National Press Building. I said, we don't have a lot of money, but do you have an office? And they said, yeah, we just refurbished it. They gutted it. They took the old National Press Building, they gutted it, and rebuilt brand new offices totally inside. So I got in there just as they were brand new, a new National Press Building. And they said, yeah, we haven't sold all our space yet, so yeah, here's some office. So I picked and it was affordable. They gave me a good deal because I was a nonprofit. And we had a very nice office there. I think Jerry Sass would have been happier if I had been able to find something at the Society of Newspaper Editors. But they were not accommodating.
And speaking about being in Washington, D.C. and proximity,
Yeah.
What about connections, now that there was this established organization for Latino journalists? Were there any connections with other Latino organizations like National Council for La Raza, etc.?
To some degree. There was no real desire on the part of the board for me to reach out to these groups. I would get invited to things periodically. But by and large, the feeling was we as journalists should just deal with journalists. And so most of the contact I had with people was with organizations and people in the National Press Building or with the Washington Post. Not so much the Washington Star, which was very conservative. But the desire of the board was not to mingle with non-journalists so much. So when we were in the National Press Building, we just tended to deal with journalists.
Okay. So we're moving. We're going to talk about the conferences that you were holding.
Yes. The conference. Okay. People talk about the San Diego conference as the first conference, national conference. It was not actually the first. It was the second. The first, that conference in San Diego was in December. The first conference was just a few months before, in August of 1982. And it was just for Spanish language media. And it was national in scope in that we had people from Chicago, we had representatives from the Southwest, we had Texas, for example, different parts of Texas. We had reporters and news people from Miami, representing the Cuban community. And it was all Spanish language media. In fact, the keynote speaker was, I think it was, I was going to say Gustavo Godoy, but I'm not, no. He was the publisher of El Diario La Prensa in New York City. I was very proud of that. So we had the editor of the biggest Spanish language newspaper. We had representatives from La Opinión in LA, and from other publications, Spanish publications, and Spanish media, broadcast media, at this conference, including Maria Elena Salinas, who was not a big media star then. She was getting started as a reporter at KMEX in those days, which became Univision, and then later she became an anchor, and finally national anchor for the news. But it was a conference to bring Spanish-speaking reporters and journalists in general, together for the very first time. And nobody had ever done this. And so we had a meeting, a 3-day meeting. We had about 200 people, 150 maybe, from around the country. And it was a wonderful meeting. It was very worthwhile. It did not, it was a good start, but the fact that it was just Spanish language media limited the impact. Other journalists, other reporters, even though they were Latino, did not embrace the Spanish language conference. So, NAHJ now has adopted this ENYE. Okay. In the beginning, the outreach to Spanish language media was not a major concern or interest. They said, yeah, we should do that. We should have Spanish language media, members. But even though my very first national conference was a Spanish language conference, it didn't carry over. People did not want another Spanish language media conference. And the focus became then the national conference, which was mainly for English language media. There was always a desire to have some of the sessions in Spanish or bilingual sessions at the national conference, but the focus was on English. And it was a feeling that's the name, it's the United States, everybody speaks English, and we're Latinos, but the real powers that be in the media are English-speaking media. So that's how it got started. From people involved, so my first national effort was Spanish language. Then I started to work on the San Diego conference, which is now called the First National Hispanic Media Conference. It was broader in scope. It involved not just journalists, but other Latino groups, like the publishers. I'd mentioned Kirk Whistler to you before. Knew a lot of publishers. They were trying to start a publishers group. And he used the San Diego conference to inaugurate his national organization. We had groups from, in fact, where's my, I have a list here of the organizations that participated. I believe I have it here. Oh, I'm sorry. A lot of these groups got involved in it. The different CCNMA chapters throughout the United States, throughout California, San Diego in particular. Fresno people got involved. Big contingent from Tucson, from Dallas, from Albuquerque. We had some people from New York and Boston. And a few people from Miami. Since it was still a new idea, and as far as people were concerned, there had never been a Hispanic media conference. There was not a big impetus, a big say, oh yeah, we gotta go. So I made a personal point of traveling to various cities. Admittedly not with the board's knowledge or approval. The CCNMA board probably didn't appreciate it, but I flew to Miami, I flew to Dallas, I flew to New York City, I went to a number of cities, and I said, we're going to have this big conference in San Diego in December. And I gave a talk to these groups, whatever journalists I could find, and tried to encourage them to come. And I got well received in some of the Philadelphia. They were very open and interested. Juan Gonzalez got involved because of that. Chicago, got several people from Chicago to come. Miami was a tough sell. The Miami people said, "What? Wow, there's other people in other cities, other Latino. No, just Miami." They, but I think we got a few people from Hispanic Magazine. I think it was still in Miami in those days. Some of them came. The Spanish language daily in Miami.
El Nuevo Herald?
El Nuevo Herald, yes, okay. they sent one or two people. So we did get some national representation. We had about 200 or so people at that first conference, 300 maybe in San Diego. But it generated a lot of interest and a lot of excitement, and people saw the potential. And the feeling right after that, and people were coming up to me, we got to do this again, and we got to create our own group. We got to create a national journalist group. And so I approached Jerry Sass. I said, if we did this, there seems to be a real interest. Will you continue to help us? And yeah, and later he did come and give us some more money. It worked well.
So that what you mentioned that he came back and
Oh.
supported, that was when the one incident?
Well, yeah, he came to the San Diego conference. He was very happy with it. He enjoyed it very much. And we had good representation from national media. Capital Cities, which in those days, I don't even know if Cap Cities still exists, but it was an up-and-coming company. And they ended up buying ABC. It became Capital Cities ABC. They had bought American Broadcasting Company. It shows you how well they were doing. They had a lot of representation. The New York Times showed up. And all of this spun out of that job fair that I had been working on at USC. Many of the news organizations that came to that said, if you can have a national conference, we'll help you. And it worked. And I thought everything went very well at the national conference, the first one, the San Diego conference. Washington, D.C. was really a challenge, much more so, because that's where the reactionary part of CCNMA really kicked in. Instead of embracing the national conference, instead of reaching out to fellow Latino journalists, the CCNMA board said, we don't want you to spend any money on this Washington, D.C. conference, and we don't want our staff to be used for anything in Washington, D.C., which really was like cutting my hands off. I had extra money, another pot of money from Gannett. There wasn't CCNMA money, so I was able to hire someone, one staff person, to give me a hand, but it made it very, very difficult. So I had many problems organizing the Washington, D.C. conference. And I guess some CCNMA people went, but it was at that point that CCNMA really said, no, we're California and that's all we want. And they changed, they became more open to it later, but at that point, in 1983, 84, they were very resistant. So, but a lot more people came. We had 500 at the second conference. We had a really good turnout. We almost had Ronald Reagan. That was one of the worst days of my life. Do you mind if I talk about that?
Go ahead, please.
So we're going to Washington, D.C. for the National Hispanic Media Conference. We got to get Reagan. You got to get Reagan. Everybody's yelling at me. We got to get Reagan. I said, okay, I'll try and get Reagan. And I worked, one of the hardest things I ever did was working with the White House. They didn't want to come. No, Reagan is president. He doesn't care about this. He's too busy. He's got all these other things. So they kept saying no. So I did not put Reagan in the program or the White House. Fine. Okay. Everybody's disappointed, but they're saying, okay, Reagan doesn't care about us. Okay. His people never told him personally, Ronald himself. I know this because the morning was it that morning or the day before? We're in Washington. I'm busy coordinating the conference as it's going on. I get a call from the White House, my contact. Oh, President Reagan. He's on a plane today from Dallas, Texas, and he saw the agenda for today, because it was tomorrow, the day before. So he wanted to see what's on the agenda of activities for tomorrow. And one of the things, the one concession we had gotten from the White House was a press briefing by Larry Speakes. No Reagan, but Larry Speakes, the press secretary, would meet the group. And so we got something. Well, he said, he's on the plane, and this press person is telling me, President Reagan saw your name on the agenda for the White House, Hispanic journalists. And I said, yeah. And he said, he wants to speak to you. The world stopped. It was horrible. It should have been a great moment. It should have been a great moment. But when the president decided he was going to speak, not just Larry Speakes, his press person, but he himself, Reagan, was going to speak to the Hispanic journalists, the Secret Service got involved. And the Secret Service comes to me. We were at the Capitol Hilton Hotel. They want a complete list of all of our attendees. And they want their Social Security numbers. Okay? In one day. I don't have... It was just... You've seen the registration. Here's the registration for the coming to the national conference. I don't ask for anybody's Social Security's number. I had no need for it. They wanted Social Security numbers. They were going to do background checks instantaneously on all these people. I had over 500 journalists. And then, so I have to give an announcement at the banquet that night before Reagan talks in the morning. So, guess what? The White House has said President Reagan will speak to you. Everybody goes hysterical. And I said, but wait. They must have your Social Security number tonight so I can give it to them tomorrow morning. Okay? You cannot get in if I don't get your Social Security number. Everybody rushes up after the dinner that night, the big banquet, and I had some staff, and we got it all. We got their names and Social Security numbers, and I take it to the White House, and then everybody goes. Everybody, they've all got to be there because Reagan is going to talk. Well, fine. You've never been to the White House. Okay? You have to go through all kinds of screening, like airport screening, but much more to get into the White House. Because it was at the press room of the White House. And the Secret Service is all over it. And there's a rule that the president cannot come into a room without guard dogs, the bomb sniffing dogs, have to come into that room within 30 minutes. If more than 30 minutes go by and the dogs have not okayed the room, the president cannot walk into that room. So we have to get everybody vetted and into the room in a half an hour. Otherwise, they'll all have to leave the room. The dogs will have to come back in, clean out the room, make sure there's no bombs in the room. Everybody comes back in, and then President Reagan will come in. So it's like a madhouse. And Secret Service does not have a sense of humor. They are not happy-go-lucky guys. They're big, they carry guns, and they don't smile. And then in the midst of all of this pandemonium of trying to get everybody into that press room in 30 minutes, this Secret Service guy comes up to me. He says, "Who's your boss?" And oh, it's that guy. They're all pointing at me. I can see him coming. And he comes up to me and he shows me this guy's name. Now, I knew the name. It was a journalist from Miami. I don't remember his name now. And when they were doing the screenings of Social Security numbers, his name came up as a red flag. Somebody not desirable. I don't know why. They didn't. He's a security risk. Who is he? Why is he at your conference? Why do you have people like this at your conference? Don't you have control over who's in charge of who attends your conference? I said, well, it's a national. I don't know if everybody is coming in as some kind of government security risk, and they're just journalists. He said, "Oh, Mr. Reagan cannot speak to you. I can't condone the president speaking to you." So then I had to go out and announce to everybody, and everybody's like super excited. and I have to go tell them, Mr. Reagan is not going to appear. They all wanted to kill me. I got death threats. I swear to God, I got death threats. Almost. I got a lot of nasty notes. It was a terrible day. So the Washington conference was, wow, that was something. And anyway, the other conferences were a lot easier than the Washington conference. But I remember that day with Reagan. Yeah.
Well, that's quite a story.
It was a real challenge. As to the difference between what NHJ was and what it's dealing with nowadays is very hard for me to judge and to comment on, really, because the nature of the media has changed, not just at 360 degrees, it's almost cosmic, the number of changes. When I was director of NHJ, the real strength of journalism was daily newspapers. Daily newspapers have all diminished. There were 1,700 when I was there. Now there's only a few. TV journalism isn't what it used to be. There was no internet when I was NHJ director. People didn't even have home computers. We didn't have laptops. There was no internet. There was none of these things. Not even email. We didn't even have email. So the things, and we didn't have 24-hour news the way they have, like CNN and all of that. The world that journalists have to deal with now, and the career, is so different. It's hard for me to make a meaningful comment. But I know the need is still there. I know the discrimination still goes on. There's still a sense that if you're a minority, you're not a professional. And there isn't that respect that they really are entitled to and that they've worked hard to get. So the problems still exist, but the nature of the media has changed at a galactic level. It is so different now from 1985, 1988, that it's hard to make a comparison.